Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. A groan escaped from beneath the covers as Ron slowly stirred, his mind foggy with sleep. He blinked, trying to remember why he felt a sense of dread creeping into his consciousness. Then it hit him. Today was the day. April 1st. His Aunt Carol's wedding day, and the day he'd agreed to an utterly ridiculous plan. I can't believe I'm actually going through with this, Ron muttered, dragging himself out of bed. He caught sight of the garment bag hanging on his closet door and winced. Inside was a dress, a flower girl dress to be precise. It had all started as a joke. His stepsister Alice had come up with the idea during a family dinner last month. Wouldn't it be hilarious if Ron and I switched roles for the wedding? She'd said, grinning mischievously. I mean, it is on April Fool's Day after all. To Ron's horror, Aunt Carol had loved the idea. She'd always been the fun, quirky aunt of the family, and the thought of shaking things up at her wedding appealed to her immensely. Before Ron could protest, it was decided. He would be the flower girl, and Alice would be the ring bearer. Now, as he stood in front of the mirror, running a hand through his messy brown hair, Ron wondered if he could fake a sudden illness. But no, he'd promised, and he wasn't one to back out of a commitment, no matter how embarrassing. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Ron, you up? It was his mother's voice. Alice is here to help you get ready. Ron sighed. Yeah, I'm up. Come in. The door opened, and Alice bounced in, looking far too cheerful for Ron's liking. She was already dressed in a smart little suit, her short blonde hair neatly combed. Morning, bro. Ready to become the prettiest flower girl this wedding has ever seen, Ron groaned. Can't we just call this whole thing off? Alice shook her head, her blue eyes twinkling with amusement. No way. Aunt Carol is counting on us. Now come on, we've got a lot of work to do. For the next hour, Ron endured what he could only describe as torture. Alice helped him into the dress, a pale pink confection of tulle and satin that fell just below his knees. It had a fitted bodice and short puff sleeves with a big bow at the back. Ron felt ridiculous. Stop fidgeting, Alice scolded as she zipped him up. You'll wrinkle the fabric. How am I supposed to breathe in this thing? Ron complained, tugging at the bodice. Alice rolled her eyes. Welcome to the world of women's fashion. Now sit down, we need to do your hair and makeup. Ron's eyes widened. Makeup? You never said anything about makeup. Of course there's makeup, Alice said, pushing him down onto a chair. You can't be a flower girl without a little glam. What followed was a crash course in cosmetics that left Ron's head spinning. Foundation, concealer, blush, eyeshadow, mascara. He lost track of all the products Alice applied to his face. By the time she was done, Ron hardly recognized himself in the mirror. And now for the finishing touch, Alice said, producing a long, curly wig from her bag. It was the same shade of brown as Ron's natural hair, but fell past his shoulders in soft waves. You've got to be kidding me, Ron muttered as Alice fitted the wig onto his head, securing it with pins. Stop complaining, Alice said, adjusting the wig. You look amazing. Mom's going to cry when she sees you. As if on cue, their mother walked in, stopping short when she saw Ron. Her hands flew to her mouth, eyes welling up with tears. Oh, honey, she breathed. You look beautiful. Ron felt his face flush beneath the makeup. Thanks, Mom, he mumbled, feeling more self-conscious than ever. We should get going, Alice said, checking her watch. We don't want to be late. The car ride to the church was an experience in itself. Ron had never appreciated how much space a full skirt took up until he was trying to maneuver into the back seat of his mother's sedan. The tulle seemed to have a life of its own, billowing up around him and threatening to suffocate him. Careful with that dress, his mother cautioned from the driver's seat. We don't want it getting wrinkled before the ceremony. Ron bit back a sarcastic retort, focusing instead on trying to arrange his skirt in a way that didn't make him feel like he was drowning in fabric. Alice, sitting next to him, seemed to be enjoying his discomfort immensely. "Just wait until you have to walk down the aisle," she said with a grin. "Everyone's going to be looking at you." The thought made Ron's stomach churn. He'd never been comfortable being the center of attention, and now he was going to have to parade down the aisle in a dress, tossing flower petals like some kind of deranged fairy. He closed his eyes, taking deep breaths to calm his nerves. When they arrived at the church, Ron's anxiety reached new heights. The parking lot was already filling up with guests, and he could see people milling about near the entrance. How was he supposed to get inside without everyone seeing him? "Relax," Alice said, noticing his panic. "We'll go in through the side door. No one will see you until it's time." True to her word, Alice managed to sneak Ron into the church undetected. They made their way to a small room off to the side where the bridal party was gathering. Aunt Carol was there, resplendent in her wedding gown, surrounded by her bridesmaids. When she saw Ron, her face lit up. "Oh my goodness!" she exclaimed, rushing over to enfold him in a careful hug. "You look absolutely adorable. This was the best idea ever." Ron managed a weak smile, trying to ignore the curious stares and barely suppressed giggles from the bridesmaids. He felt like a circus attraction, on display for everyone's amusement. The next hour passed in a blur of last-minute preparations and instructions. Ron was given a small basket filled with rose petals and shown how to scatter them as he walked. He practiced his flower girl walk under Alice's critical eye, trying not to trip over his own feet. Before he knew it, it was time. Ron found himself lined up behind the bridesmaids, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Alice gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder before taking her place at the front of the line, the ring pillow clutched in her hands. The music started, and one by one, the bridal party began to make their way down the aisle. All too soon, it was Ron's turn. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the doorway. The church fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Ron felt his face burning beneath the makeup, acutely aware of every eye on him. For a moment, he froze, unable to move. Then, from somewhere in the pews, he heard a soft whisper. "Go on, sweetie. You can do it." It was enough to break him out of his paralysis. Slowly, Ron began to walk, scattering rose petals as he went. He kept his eyes focused on the ground, too afraid to look up and see the reactions of the guests. As he neared the altar, he chanced a glance up. To his surprise, he didn't see mockery or disgust on the faces of the guests. Instead, he saw smiles, some amused, others touched. An elderly woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Feeling a bit more confident, Ron finished his walk down the aisle, taking his place next to Alice. She gave him a subtle thumbs up, and for the first time that day, Ron felt a small sense of accomplishment. He'd done it. He'd walked down the aisle in a dress in front of a church full of people, and the world hadn't ended. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Ron stood quietly, trying not to fidget too much in his uncomfortable dress. He watched as Aunt Carol and her new husband exchanged vows, barely registering the words as his mind wandered to the reception ahead. How was he going to make it through an entire evening in this get-up? After the ceremony, as the guests filed out of the church, Ron found himself swept up in a whirlwind of congratulations and compliments. "You made such a lovely flower girl. That dress is absolutely darling on you. I can't believe how well you pulled that off." Ron smiled and nodded, feeling increasingly overwhelmed by the attention. He was grateful when Alice appeared at his side, steering him towards the exit. "Come on, flower girl," she said with a grin. "Time to head to the reception. You've got a whole night of dancing ahead of you." The reception was held at a nearby country club, its ballroom transformed into a springtime wonderland. Soft pink and white flowers adorned every table, and twinkling fairy lights hung from the ceiling. Under different circumstances, Ron might have appreciated the decor. As it was, he was too preoccupied with trying to navigate the room without tripping over his dress or bumping into anyone with his ridiculously full skirt. Dinner was a challenge in itself. Ron had never realized how difficult it was to eat while wearing a dress. He had to be constantly vigilant to avoid spilling anything on the pale pink fabric, and the fitted bodice made it hard to take deep breaths. By the time the main course was cleared away, he was exhausted. "Having fun?" Alice asked, sliding into the seat next to him. She looked perfectly comfortable in her suit, and Ron felt a pang of envy. "Oh, yeah, it's a blast," he replied sarcastically. "I especially love how I can't eat or breathe properly." Alice laughed. "Come on, it's not that bad. Look how happy Aunt Carol is." Ron glanced over at the bride's table, where Aunt Carol was beaming, her eyes sparkling with joy. He had to admit seeing her so happy did make the whole ordeal seem a bit more worthwhile. "I guess," he conceded. "But I'll be glad when this is over and I can get back to normal clothes." As if on cue, the DJ announced that it was time for the bouquet toss. Ron groaned as Alice pulled him to his feet. "Oh no," he protested. "I am not catching that bouquet." "Come on," Alice insisted, dragging him towards the group of women gathering on the dance floor. "It's tradition, and besides, you're the flower girl. You have to participate." Before Ron could argue further, he found himself in the middle of a crowd of eager women, all with their eyes fixed on Aunt Carol as she prepared to throw her bouquet. Ron stood at the back, hoping to avoid any involvement. Aunt Carol turned her back to the crowd, counted to 3, and tossed the bouquet over her shoulder. Ron watched in horror as the flowers arced through the air, heading straight for him. Without thinking, he reached up and caught it, the stems smacking into his palms. A cheer went up from the crowd, and Ron found himself the center of attention once again. He blushed furiously as people congratulated him, making jokes about him being the next to get married. Alice was doubled over with laughter, clutching her sides. "Your face!" she gasped between giggles. "Oh man, I wish I'd gotten that on camera." Ron glared at her, thrusting the bouquet into her hands. "Here, you take it. I'm done being the center of attention." As the night wore on, Ron found himself relaxing a bit. The initial shock of being in a dress had worn off, and he had to admit there was something liberating about swishing around the dance floor in a full skirt. He even allowed himself to be pulled into a few dances, twirling and laughing with various family members. It was well past midnight when the reception finally wound down. Ron was exhausted, his feet aching from the unfamiliar shoes, his head heavy from the weight of the wig. As guests began to filter out, he turned to his mother, ready to go home and change back into his normal clothes. Sweetie," his mother said, looking a bit sheepish. "There's been a slight change of plans. Your father and I are staying at the hotel here tonight, and Alice is going to a friend's house. We thought you might like to stay with Aunt Carol at her place. She's got plenty of room, and it'll give you two a chance to bond." Ron stared at her in disbelief. "But my clothes, I can't stay in this dress all night." His mother patted his arm. "Don't worry, Alice packed a bag for you. It's in Aunt Carol's car." Before Ron could protest further, Aunt Carol appeared, still radiant despite the long day. "Ready to go, flower girl?" she asked with a wink. "I've got ice cream and movies waiting at home." And so Ron found himself climbing into Aunt Carol's car, still dressed in his flower girl outfit. As they drove through the quiet streets, Aunt Carol chatted happily about the wedding and her plans for the honeymoon. "I can't thank you enough for going along with this, Ron," she said, glancing over at him. "It really made the day special." Ron managed a small smile. "I'm glad you enjoyed it, Aunt Carol. It was an experience." When they arrived at Aunt Carol's house, Ron was relieved to finally be able to change. He eagerly grabbed the bag Alice had packed, only to discover, to his horror, that his sister had played one final prank on him. The bag contained not his usual t-shirt and shorts, but a pair of pink pajamas with little hearts all over them, clearly borrowed from one of Alice's friends. There was also a note that read, "Thought you might want to keep the theme going. Love, Alice." Ron groaned, burying his face in his hands. It seemed his day as a girl wasn't quite over yet. Aunt Carol, seeing his distress, couldn't help but laugh. "Oh, Alice," she said, shaking her head. "She's always been a troublemaker. Don't worry, Ron. They look comfy, and no one but me will see you." Resigned to his fate, Ron changed into the pajamas. He had to admit they were softer and more comfortable than the dress had been. He spent the rest of the night eating ice cream and watching movies with Aunt Carol, trying not to think about the fact that he was wearing girls' pajamas. The next morning, Ron woke up feeling disoriented. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or why he was wearing pink pajamas. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and he groaned, burying his face in the pillow. A knock on the door roused him. "Ron, are you awake?" It was Aunt Carol's voice. "Breakfast is ready when you are. Oh, and Alice dropped off some clothes for you earlier." Ron perked up at that. Finally, he could get back to his normal self. He quickly got up and opened the door, finding a small pile of clothes on the floor. His heart sank as he realized these weren't his usual clothes either. Alice had brought him a sundress and sandals with another note. "Thought you might want to match the spring weather. Don't worry, I'll bring your real clothes later. Enjoy your girl day." Ron stared at the clothes in disbelief. This prank was going too far. But what choice did he have? He couldn't very well wear the flower girl dress or the pajamas out in public. With a heavy sigh, Ron put on the sundress. It was a light blue with white polka dots falling just above his knees. The sandals, at least, were more comfortable than the dress shoes he'd worn yesterday. When he walked into the kitchen, Aunt Carol beamed at him. "Oh, don't you look lovely? That color really suits you." Ron managed a weak smile, settling down at the table. "Thanks, Aunt Carol. I don't suppose you have any of my normal clothes lying around?" Aunt Carol shook her head. "I'm afraid not, dear. But don't worry, Alice said she'd bring your things over this afternoon. In the meantime, why don't we go for a walk in the park? It's such a beautiful day." And so, Ron found himself strolling through the local park in a sundress and sandals, trying to act as if everything was normal. To his surprise, no one seemed to give him a second glance. A few people even smiled and nodded as they passed. As they walked, Aunt Carol linked her arm through Ron's. "You know," she said softly, "I hope you know how much it meant to me that you went along with this whole thing. I know it wasn't easy for you." Ron looked at her, seeing the genuine appreciation in her eyes. "It was different," he admitted, "but I'm glad it made you happy." Aunt Carol squeezed his arm. "It did. And you know what? I think it was good for you, too. Sometimes it's important to step out of our comfort zones, to see things from a different perspective." Ron pondered her words as they continued their walk. He had to admit, the past day had been eye-opening in many ways. He'd experienced things he never thought he would, and while it hadn't always been comfortable, it had certainly been memorable. When they returned to the house, Alice was waiting for them, a bag of Ron's clothes in hand and a mischievous grin on her face. "So, how was your extended girl time?" she asked, barely containing her laughter. Ron rolled his eyes, snatching the bag from her. "You're evil, you know that." Alice shrugged. "Maybe, but admit it, you had fun." As Ron changed back into his usual jeans and t-shirt, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. For a moment, he could still see traces of the flower girl he'd been yesterday, a hint of glitter on his cheeks, a slight curl in his hair. He smiled to himself. It had been a crazy experience, one he'd never forget. And while he was happy to be back in his own clothes, a small part of him had to admit, he'd made a pretty cute flower girl. As he joined his family in the living room, Ron felt a newfound appreciation for the women in his life and the effort they put into their appearances. He'd always take it a bit easier on Alice when she took forever to get ready from now on. "So," Aunt Carol said, a twinkle in her eye, "same time next year for the anniversary party?" Ron laughed, shaking his head. "Nice try, Aunt Carol, but I think my flower girl days are officially over, or maybe..." Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All linked